so we're rolling.
Yep.
Good to go? Perfect. Without further ado, I invite the first affirmative to begin the debate. Here.
The US Navy Marine Mammal Program is a system akin to animal slavery. It is one that strips dolphins and sea lions of their agency to do as they wish and not be used as a mere means instead of an end unto themselves, and be sacrificed in the name of the US military, one of the most corrupt institutions in the world. We're very proud to affirm this evening. I'm going to discuss a few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to discuss what it means to be immoral. Secondly, why there is a colossal moral harm to animals. And thirdly, why even if there is some wild way that dolphins can consent to this, they're consenting to an action that makes them immoral actors by conspiring with the US military. Let's firstly talk about what it means to be immoral. Two things here. Firstly, observe that morality is not solely outcome dependent. Often in debating, moral arguments are just washed by utilitarian practice. That is not the status of this debate, one that specifically discusses morality. We would like to observe that we would not murder someone to stop all the headaches in the world, even if somehow we could add up a utilitarian benefit, because we believe that it is just wrong to murder someone in and of itself. That is a moral harm. The second thing to observe is that morality is at least somewhat absolute. That is to say that merely being marginally better than an alternative does not mean that you are absolutely a moral actor. We believe that it is wrong to conspire with immoral actors, even if somehow you can prove that an alternative is also immoral. It's possible for two things to both be bad at the same time. The next thing I'd like to just observe is in regards to the animals that we are talking about. We are talking about actively complex, intelligent life forms in things like dolphins and sea lions. They are among the smartest animals that exist in the world. That's to say that in this debate, we believe that all animals deserve rights, but we'd like to observe that these animals are the closest thing akin to humans that we can observe within the rest of the animal kingdom. And that means that all of the reasons why we ascribe rights to humans, we believe, should extend this far. We believe that we do not subscribe to blind utilitarianism in this debate. We should sense check our moral values when we are discussing these animals. Additionally, this debate, I think, is clearly quite analogous to things such as conscription, and so morality is quite similar in this regard to in those. Therefore, 2 points of substantive. Firstly, let's talk about the animals and just how colossally they are violated in this debate. I've already observed these animals are intelligent life forms. They are social life forms. They do things like they can feel pleasure, they can feel pain. We'd like to observe here, all animals clearly deserve some rights in the status quo. And in fact, we believe that animals deserve a lot more rights than they are currently given. We think it's wrong to do things such as strip animals of their agency. We believe that broadly, domestication of animals across the board is a moral harm. It's not one that we can easily fix in this debate, but we would, on a principled level, extend this policy that far. What we definitely can do in terms of this debate is observe that this policy is absolutely something that is wrong. Why do we see this? A couple of reasons. Let's firstly discuss that these animals cannot consent to any of the harms that they are likely to suffer. That is for the reasons that even though they are intelligent life forms, they cannot speak human language, and therefore they cannot have the harms that they are, the risk of what they are about to do explained to them very clearly. I think there are two things to observe here. Firstly, that means that any harm that accrues to them is immoral in and of itself. It is moral to force people to do things that they cannot consent to, even if somehow you could prove utilitarian benefit. Secondly, observe that they are likely to suffer an incredible practical harm in this debate, because they're likely to be directly targeted by other militaries that see them being used as weapons by the US, as things that are actively seeking out particular minerals, as things that have like incredible sight. They're likely to be targeted, and that means they're likely to die in this debate. Observe that means that A, that is a practical harm, but B, this is a debate where moral weighing is very important, and we would morally weigh any practical harm that someone has not consented to as the biggest practical harm that exists in this debate. I think that already means that it's a very big moral harm. Secondly, note that we instrumentalize these animals. There's this in three ways. Firstly, we are conscripting them. We are treating them like they are in a manner akin to conscripting people to fight in wars for us. They are not given the right to choose as to whether they do this. They are merely taken in, and they are sort of like, and they coerced into doing this by doing things such as like giving them food if they don't, punishing them if they giving them food if they do, punishing them if they don't. We're conscripting them. Secondly, we are using them as a mere means rather than an end unto themselves. We are not treating them as if they are a good unto themselves. We are treating them as a way in which humans can benefit, and that in and of itself is also immoral. We are cutting them off from all other choices and stripping away all of their agency. The third thing we'd like to say is that we are effectively at this point enslaving these animals, and we are enslaving them specifically for military means, which we think means that because they are performing incredibly dangerous tasks, they have no choice, they are not rewarded for this, they are likely to suffer an incredible moral harm. What does this mean in the sake of this debate? There are some inherent rights that people, and we extend this to animals, and we especially extend this to things like dolphins and sea lions, the inherent rights that they have that we must not violate. We believe that it is very valid in this debate to draw analogies between things like dolphins and humans. They have all of the same they have all of the same mental capabilities as us, other than they speak a different language. Like in Hitchhikers, they literally knew more than us and escaped before everyone else did. I think at this point, things like slavery and things like conscription were never justified when they happen to humans, and they should never be justified when it happens to animals. Even if somehow they can prove a utilitarian benefit, we believe there is an absolute moral harm that they need to suffer to get to that point, and that in this debate, which is directly about morality by the topic itself, is debate winning for our side. The second thing I'd like to establish in this debate is even if somehow they could prove that animals were able to consent to this, they were consenting to an immoral action that meant that if humans were not the immoral actor by conscripting them, the dolphins were an immoral actor by allowing themselves to join in. Why do we think the US military is an incredibly problematic institution in this debate? I think we'd like to observe a couple of things here. Firstly, we've already established how there's like a consequentialist impact that you have in this particular debate as a dolphin by like joining in the US military, because you're actively giving them the benefit of your echolocation. But even if there was no benefit that the US military was accruing because the alternative was some kind of technology that they would develop otherwise, you are still conspiring with them to achieve their ends. Why do we think the ends of the US military are especially evil and immoral to join in on in this debate? We believe that they impose imperialism throughout the world in a couple of ways. Firstly, there is hard power that they engage in. This looks like actively invading countries. We've seen this for decades. More recently, this looks like places such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Many of these wars completely unjustified or literally invading countries actively contrary to their own logic. I think that that's an incredibly problematic thing to join in on. Secondly, it looks like soft power. It looks like funding proxy wars. That's happened throughout the Cold War. It's happened more recently in Syria. Again, the problem with this is that they are actively creating instability within the world. They are actively imposing their imperialism throughout the world in a very immoral way. We'd like to observe that specifically the fact that they are helping the US Navy is quite problematic, because the US Navy has huge power in the way that it engages with all of the trade networks that the US uses to impose their mandate throughout the world. I think that the thing that we need to observe here is what are the impacts of what happens when we look at the US military. It looks like genuinely actively engaging in things like war crimes, and I think there is an extent to which you are able to, the dolphins and the sea lions are actively somewhat complicit in the actions of the US military by allowing them to have the information that allows them to do things that are incredibly problematic in this debate. I don't think the dolphins themselves are probably selling arms to Nicaragua and using it to fund cocaine in black communities, but they are very much allowing an institution to continue to exist and continue to be prevalent that is perpetuating that, and I think that being complicit in that is incredibly problematic. Conspiring with the US was a major moral harm, and even if you somehow thought that the US does a just job, you were still, in terms of they were invading countries that were also immoral, that does not make the US moral in and of themselves. Either the dolphins were making a bad choice or they were being forced to. At the end of this debate, the important thing to acknowledge is this topic is truly wild because it's about morality, but that means that firstly, either you're in a system where you are actively forcing animals against their will to do incredibly problematic things and to lose all of their agency, or you were a dolphin that was joining in of your own volition. Either of those was terrible. Proud to affirm.
Cool, I think first affirmative speech. I now invite first negative to begin their team's case. Here.
All good to start? Cool. There are a few things that I want to say after hearing that. I think the first thing to say is that First Affirmative doesn't just get to rock up and delete utilitarianism as like a legitimate school of thought. It's not enough to come up and say like, oh well, like morality is absolute and we don't get to do things that might be bad, even if they provide like very, very good outcomes. The second thing to say is that I also don't think they get to come up here and dunk on the US military and somehow win by that metric. It can be moral for like an actor to make use of available technologies and resources, even if you have thoughts about like the actions of that actor. The question is not like whether the US military is moral and whether like dolphins participating in that organization of their own volition somehow would be moral. The question is whether like the utilization of dolphins and sea lions for this purpose is moral. Okay, so a few things after hearing that speech. What do we hear from First Affirmative? We get 3 pushes. Firstly, we hear that this is just like plainly immoral. The first thing that they tell you is that like morality is not outcome dependent. I think that it's unclear to me why this is true, right? Because like, I don't know, sorry to like come up here and talk about the trolley problem, but like maybe you could kill one person to save 50,000, right? I think it is probably objectively true that like killing a person could be bad. However, if you could save 50,000 people, that would be pretty good, right? Which means that like probably as a society, we're generally prepared to accept that like you could do something that has a certain bad outcome if the bad outcome that you're preventing by like doing the first bad thing is like so much worse. Like the outcome would be so much worse, right? They also tell you that morality is absolute. I think this is just like clearly untrue. Morality is deeply subjective. This is like pretty well documented and accepted within like the realm of philosophical thought. I think it's like deeply untrue and kind of like uncharitable to come up and be like, yes, morality is absolute. Like if morality was absolute, we would all just like be the exact same person doing the exact same things all the time. It's deeply unclear to me why this is true. The second thing they tell you is that there's like a significant moral harm in terms of like animals, and also that like they would go so far as to like undomesticate animals. I think this is kind of silly, just because like firstly we have limited information about how like animals experience things, but even if you believe everything they tell you about like dolphins and pleasure and pain and what this experience is going to be like for them, I think like over the course of my speech I'm going to tell you why like the utilitarian or like the utility that you gain from this is just like probably more important at this point in time, and like you know like the geopolitical context, right? The last thing to say is that like, oh, it would be really bad if the dolphin cooperated with the US military. I'm not going to spend that much time on this because like I think even they concede that like it's probably pretty unlikely that the dolphins have like consent to the extent that they can like acknowledge the geopolitical actor that the US military is and then like decide to participate. I think we can all just agree that like the question is about the morality of using the dolphins and not like how moral the dolphins themselves are as actors in this debate. Okay, so in terms of my speech, on setup, firstly, like what does this look like? I think there is a significant lack of setup from Affirmative in that they just rock up and kind of tell you a bunch of stuff about morality and then tell you that the dolphins are probably going to die. I'm going to do the setup for them and say that what I think this probably looks like is the dolphins are probably, and the sea lions, are probably going to have like most of their significant needs met, right? You need healthy dolphins to be able to like swim long distances. You need to feed your dolphins in order for them to like go and do cool things like echolocation or whatever. A really sick dolphin is like not going to do what you need it to do. Therefore, I think the military has a pretty good incentive to like breed, train, support healthy animals, which means to say their quality of life is going to be pretty good. This is probably a net good, right? The second thing to say is like how these dolphins can be used. The first thing to say here is that like I think it's probably going to be pretty covert in a sense that like the military doesn't want their dolphins to be discovered. First, like I think this is pretty intuitive, but just like if another like ship shoots your dolphin, that is one less excellent, highly trained dolphin that you have. That's really lame. The military doesn't want that. Note that this is directly responsive to the likelihood of harm, the point that they give you at 1A, because like I don't think it's as likely as they tell you that dolphins are going to be like nuked in the water, right? Because they need these dolphins and sea lions to like do their jobs properly, and they want to retain them, right? It probably takes like a lifetime of training to get a dolphin to a point where it's able to like echolocate in a way that is beneficial to you. So, and also use like at appropriate times where they're like necessary, they're needed, and there's no other like way that you could do it. Probably because like machines are slightly more reliable, but in instances where they don't have the technology or like they can't use the technology, they're going to like default to the dolphin or the sea lion, right? Which means to say, at the end of this point, firstly, or the end of the setup, firstly, dolphins are probably going to have like relatively good living conditions, and they're probably going to be deployed well in the instances where they are deployed, right? Because the military has a like strategic incentive to keep them alive. Okay, but let's move on to like the practical part of this speech. Firstly, in terms of like why this is just like morally permissible, right? I think the first thing to say here is that it's probably morally permissible in terms of treatment, right? We as society generally accept that like things are morally permissible, use of animals is morally permissible insofar as you treat them well, right? So like we are far more likely to support things like eating beef when it is like organic, or like eating eggs when they are laid by free-range chickens or whatever. We also support like use of like guide dogs and sniffer dogs when they are guaranteed a relatively good quality of life, right? The second thing to say is that we just have a societal norm that is like in favor of the use of animals in cases where they like allow utility for humans. As noted, like we eat animals, we have guard dogs, we have sniffer dogs, we have like mounted police, right? The third thing to say is that I think I already told you in setup that the military has a strong incentive to mitigate harms that occur to these animals, meaning they are probably going to be treated well, right? You don't want your sea lion to get like killed if it's doing excellent eyesight work for you. I think after this, you can probably believe that like there is not going to be significant harm accrued by these dolphins or sea lions, but even if you don't believe that, you have to weigh the harm that these dolphins might experience against the benefit that can be accrued for like the US military and potentially like the greater world by the use of these dolphins. Which leads me on to my next piece of substantive. I don't think first affirmative can come up and say outcomes don't matter when determining morality. They very, very obviously do, and I'm going to tell you why. So, firstly, I think like the Navy just like has an obligation to protect US citizens as far as it can. I think this is empirically true. Like militaries do, at least to some extent, want to protect their citizens, right? I think animals if animals are able to like provide utility just like across society in consumption, in like training them to like do cool things, this is something that we generally accept. But I think the second thing to say here is like why are they going to be so uniquely useful? So we kind of hear from the info slide that the info slide sort of lends itself to a characterization of their use as like intel gathering, right? They have echolocation, they have excellent eyesight, they can like tell the difference between metals and stuff. So they're probably going to be like getting enemy intel, like looking into crash sites, like providing intel for the US military. Why is this particularly important and unique? I think the first thing to say here is that like sea technology is just kind of really lame and sucks a lot. The water pressure is like really bad for machinery, which is often built out of water, which means like you don't have a great idea of how your technology is going to work deep underwater because the pressure is so different. Maybe like water gets in your technology is electric, that sucks. Like radio waves operate really differently, and also technology is like significantly easier to detect than something like a dolphin, which is like meant to be there and fits into the natural seascape. Which means that these animals are going to be deployed when they are the best or the only way to do something, right? It's proven by, like, why would you pick a dolphin where you could pick like a cool sub? I think because your only option is the dolphin, right? So this is to say that they're going to be deployed when there's no other use for them, meaning the utility they provide is incredibly unique and could not be gained through any other means. We have like a moral imperative to allow like the US Navy to be good at its job. I know that first AF came out and was like, oh, but they spread imperialism and stuff. I think it's very important to note like the role that the US has as a geopolitical actor. Like it's probably quite good for like countries like us in Australia that like we have something like the US military. Okay, the point here is just that like outcomes are incredibly important. I've proven to you over this speech that dolphins and sea lions will provide like important, unique outcomes. So at the end of this, it is moral to use them because of the unique outcomes that they provide. Thanks.
Cool, I think first in the speech, I now invite second affirmative to continue their team's case. For you.
Two fundamental problems with the negative team's case, which means they cannot possibly win this debate. The first is that they literally concede right from the start that these animals cannot consent to doing this. And so they come into the fundamental moral bar that we propose at first affirmative, which is that if an intelligent creature is not consenting to being enslaved or conscripted into this form of work that puts them at a great degree of risk, you should not morally allow this behavior. It is not morally permissible. The second is they never grapple with the arguments we give you at first affirmative as why utilitarianism does not apply in this debate. It's not the case that we simply said utilitarianism doesn't exist, is that utilitarianism does not work at the extreme ends of the spectrum, where there are extreme outcomes that if you apply utilitarianism, do not make logical sense in the debate. And I'm going to move to that question now. What version of morality applies? Because for all that they criticize us that we cannot just delete utilitarianism, they cannot also just assert utilitarianism as the metric by which this debate should be judged. You have to debate the judge based on what you think is the most moral framework in order to adjudicate these animals' rights. So what do we say here? Firstly, utilitarianism does not apply at these extremes, and you can basically just reality check this argument. Like, if you apply utilitarianism to arguments about slavery, does it make sense? Because you can justify slavery by saying, well, you have some people enslaved, but they generate benefits for the rest of society. No, humanity doesn't stand for those types of things, because we say it is never just to instrumentalize someone, even if it creates a net benefit. And that is the situations where utilitarianism does not apply to this debate. They cannot just say it is just the trolley problem. It is not only the trolley problem, it's a huge slew of scenarios where utilitarianism does not make much sense. We say there are restrictions on what you can do in order to gain a benefit, a utilitarian benefit. Those are things like slavery. Those are things like torture. Those are instrumentalizing people. We say those things are not permissible under their side, under our side of the house. The next thing I want to say here is, even if utilitarianism applies, we can stand behind something like rule utilitarianism, which is that you have rules about what is permissible in order to prevent the worst and most egregious forms of conduct. So even if they think that there will be some utilitarian benefits to having this, we say, in this circumstance, if it is morally wrong because these dolphins cannot consent into it and it creates a harm upon the dolphins, or it instrumentalizes them in some way, it is still morally unacceptable to permit it, even if you think there is some justification, because the rule should still stand. The rule should still stand that we do not permit these in any circumstances, so that the most egregious circumstances are not justified or explained away by bad actors. The last thing to say here is, even if you believe none of that, it gives them an incredibly high bar as to what benefits that they have to prove in this debate. The huge amount of utilitarian benefits they have to prove to justify this morally unacceptable action and say that it is morally permissible, we say that they have not met that threshold, even taking their case at their most extreme and very best. What did we tell you in terms of moral framework? We said these animals are incredibly intelligent. They are analogous to humans in many ways because they form social circles. They do things like dolphins are the only other animal apart from humans that has sex for pleasure rather than just to reproduce. They have incredibly complex social networks, and they have language, and they speak to each other in a way that we do not understand, which means that they are analogous to humans in many ways, and they deserve rights that are analogous to humans in those instances, and therefore they deserve the same fundamental bars on what behavior is not morally permissible against them. We told you that from first affirmative. And many of the justifications that they say are reasons why you would not give rights to people who are perhaps lower in society, or not give rights to people who are for example, children are not able to access the rights fully on their side of the house. We say the reason you give people rights in the first place is to, one, the ability to protect themselves, and two, for people that cannot protect themselves, the ability to have basic rights that protect them, that others can enforce on that situation and protect them for the worst abuses. And that is analogous to animals in these instances, because they cannot protect themselves and they need basic rights in order to enforce their basic dignity. So, how did they fundamentally violate those rights? The first thing is consent. They literally concede consent from first negative speaker. They say that these animals cannot consent when they're responding to our point about the US government, which means that they've conceded the entire debate at this point. Because you cannot say that these animals fundamentally cannot consent into opting into these things and then go on and say it is justified because we are using them as a means to the end and gaining some benefit from it. We say it is always immoral to violate that consent. Even if you create a benefit in the long run, that creates a fundamental bar on whether you are able to do this action in the first place. The second thing we told you is instrumentalization. They say, well, there are other trained animals and so this is fine. But we told you from first, we do not agree with those other trained animals. We do not agree with police horses or police sniffer dogs or even pets we do not have to agree with. But let's note, taking them at their best, this is a particularly egregious form of that. One, they are more intelligent, as I've already explained, and more analogous to humans, so therefore we should care about them them more and provide higher moral bars on the types of behavior that we accept. And secondly, this is particularly bad because it's like a form of conscription. You're conscripting them into doing a military task that puts them at very high risk and is likely to, potentially lead to the end of their life and leads to the end of things like their social circles, because you are taken away from your home and your family into somewhere where you're fighting in a war zone. Well, not necessarily fighting, but doing military tasks in a war zone, which is obviously incredibly bad morally. What did we tell you? We told you it's instrumentalization because, firstly, you are turning them into just a black box. You are conditioning them in a way that you should not condition an animal that is incredibly intelligent. That looks like, for example, you train these dolphins to sniff out certain types of mines or whatever it is they're doing. I'm not sure exactly how they utilize these animals, but to train them, you have to reward them when they do this thing right and punish them when they do this thing wrong, which means you are just basically Pavlovian conditioning these animals into doing whatever you want, which is something you should not do to a fellow human, and you definitely should not do to an animal that has not consented into this behavior in the first place. The second thing we told you was that you're using them as a means to the end. In the same way you're effectively conscripting them and telling them you have to do this task, and this task is your only life. That means you're taking them away from their social circles. You're telling them the only thing important in their life is this task that you're fulfilling for someone else that does not really care about your well-being at the end of the day. What do they say? Firstly, they say animal, and this goes into the utilitarian part of the debate. Having won all the moral permissible stuff already, let's engage on their very, very best case. They say animals get a good quality of life under their side. But firstly, that is not a reason why we should support this, because we do not support things like indentured servitude, even if you think that slave is better off under their side, because it is morally not permissible to enslave them in the first place. And secondly, they still risk getting shot. They're still actively put in these conditions. They say, well, you want to keep them so you have an incentive to treat them well and keep them out of lines of fire. But in order to do these jobs like sniffing out mines or finding enemy submarines or whatever it is they're doing, you need to be in the line of fire. You cannot do it from afar if you're a dolphin, which means you're actively putting them at risk under their side. The other thing I want to note on animals is you have to ask the question, what is meaningful? Because dolphins they don't just care about food and water and sustenance. They have social lives. They have animals that they interact with. They have sex for pleasure, which means that you cannot just say they have a good quality of life under your side when you're taking away all of the things that make that life important to them in the first place. Then we say it's easy for other countries to want to take out these animals. For example, they can do things like sick other predators on them, do things like take them on with weapons and put diseases on them, which wipes out these species. Let's then talk about the US government. The question is, they just assert that the US government is moral, ignoring the reasons we give you. It is not just about the consent of dolphins here as well, because it is the dolphin training programs. If the program itself is aiding the US government, it is not just the dolphins that are immoral, it is the whole program that is immoral in aiding them in extending their imperialism. And even if they prove that this is going to be a good outcome on their side, they do not prove that this is, one, a very, very big outcome, or secondly, that this policy is specifically necessary in order to achieve that.
I thank second affirmative speech. I now invite second negative to continue their team's case. Here.
I want to clarify that I genuinely do love animals, but the unfortunate truth was we live in a world where we don't view their moral capacities as one that is equal to one of a human. We thought that was when they lost the debate, when they never told you where moral considerations arise in the first place. We think we've won the debate solely on that. I think two things to answer in this speech. Firstly, where do moral considerations necessarily come from, and how do we better fulfill that under the side of negative? And secondly, how do you mitigate a lot of the harms that they told you about, namely about how they're likely to be put at risk, namely about how they can't consent? First, on moral considerations, note that utilitarianism is a very important school of thought, in that the reason why we still consider it a legitimate way in which we process moral considerations is because it actively does have merit, which means to say we do value having utility for other individuals. We do value protecting other individuals' rights. That's when we posited the things like trolley problems. We told you that was a legitimate thought to take in this debate because you were able to protect the livelihoods of so many individuals on the ground. We thought that was a moral good that should have been considered as it is a norm in this society. I think second thing to suggest is that moral considerations often do arise as a result of societal norms, and that when we pointed to you how this is likely to be morally equivalent to things like sniffer dogs and training animals for entertainment, we thought it wasn't a sufficient response. When they tell us things like you can't like support this because they're likely to be smarter and likely to be akin to things like conscription, I have a few responses. I think on intelligence, it's simply unclear why necessarily it is true that they were likely to experience such substantial harm like they talked about. The only way in which they argue this like specific point was to argue that they're analogous to humans and therefore we extend the same rights to these people. But note, this link hasn't been explicitly proven to a very substantial degree. We argue that no, dolphins do not arise to the same level of moral considerations that we have a human, simply for the fact that we're so much more socially complex. The way in which we perceive things like pain, the way we perceive things like society, the way we perceive complex thoughts, these are the ways in which we distinguish ourselves from animals. We thought that's what gave us higher moral consideration within this debate. We thought that was why it was so substantially important for them to argue why consent was necessarily important within this debate. I think the second response here on conscription about why that was amoral, note that firstly, conscription is something that is socially accepted throughout the world. We see this in many militaries, and it's often considered a social good because we're doing things like protecting vulnerable cities within the ground. We're able to do things like protect the things we care about. We thought conscription wasn't necessarily a harm simply because you're taking individuals like away from their consent. That's when we tell you that utilitarianism is a legitimate way to view this debate, and even if you don't buy that, the moral considerations of humans were substantially more important within this debate. We tell you that at first, we tell you that now. Let's talk about some of the material that came up at first and second, right? Because the main bulk of their case boils down to arguing that they can't consent, therefore it was necessarily bad. Note, when they tell us this, when they tell us that the reason why we should care about this was because we extend the same forms of rights of humans that we do to dolphins, note that they haven't explicitly proven these links to a very substantial degree. We argue no, we don't extend the same rights we have to these individuals simply for the fact that we find it socially acceptable to do things like train animals for entertainment, to do things like raise animals for food. We are clearly shown that there are circumstances in which we legitimize trading off human animal rights for human ones. As moral, as horrible as it sounds, there are morally permissible circumstances in which we find that the rights of animals are substantially less important. Even if they can't consent, we don't think it was a necessarily important consideration within this debate. They then go on to tell us that the reason why we particularly care about it is because they're complex, they're smart, they do things like have sex for pleasure, they have things like social circles. First, notably, I don't think it's unclear as if this necessarily rises to the same level as a human, pointing to things like having sex has things like biological functions, right? For example, we tell you that them having sex doesn't necessarily mean that they arise to the same level of moral considerations as a human, but even if, it's unclear then why we still extend the same level of rights, given that for a lot of reasons humans just are significantly more socially complex creatures, and therefore something we ought to weigh more in this debate when it comes to morality, right? I think just generally at the end of all this, notably, for consent to be a necessarily important issue within this debate, they have to mechanize why this was something that we found morally acceptable, and this required them to explain why we extended the same form of rights that we give humans to dolphins on the ground. We don't think they necessarily did that, and therefore a lot of the benefits that they talked to you about fall. But let's talk about let's just look at some of the material we brought to you at first. Notably, the comparative life of a dolphin and a sea lion wasn't one that was necessarily good. The way they paint to you how they're likely to live, they told us things like how they're likely to form social circles, they told us how you're likely to have sex or pleasure, and that was the form of pleasure that they get under their side, right? Notably, they don't tell us comparatively why we tell you that the comparative was so substantially worse. When you live as an animal, you live in circumstances where you have things like uncertain, food insecurity. You are unlikely to know where you're likely to get your next meal from, and there's just a substantially larger likelihood of you dying to some random creature within the ocean, right? What this necessarily meant was the comparative on the outside was so substantially better when we gave you structural reasons to prove why we did care about these individuals as moral creatures when we're likely to do things like take care of them. What do we give to you on this front? We gave you two max. First, we told you that there was a very strong incentive to protect dolphins under outside because there's an active incentive for militaries to maintain their resources. That's when Lara came up and told you about how the ways in which we deploy these dolphins are often likely to be strategic, likely to mitigate the harms that they wanted to bring to you to a very substantial extent. Which means to say, when they tell you that we're gonna do things like put them in enemy lines, we told you that wasn't necessarily true, and even if it was very unlikely, and unlikely to weigh up against all the comparative things that we told you about. The second thing we told you about on the likelihood and moral harm was we told you that there was a likelihood to treat them to a very substantial degree, which means to say we were likely to do things like feed them, we were likely to do things like put them in good circumstances, make sure they're well stimulated, make sure they have access to things like social circles. And the simple reason why is because firstly, the outcomes of training get substantially better when you do this. When you're able to better stimulate these dolphins and support them to the best of your degree, we thought that's when you're likely to have the most successful training. That's when you're more likely to have things like more compliant dolphins. But secondly, I think the capacity to train these creatures becomes substantially higher in a world where you do treat them well. They were less likely to attack your trainers, for example. They were less likely to be violent against the individuals that were handling these dolphins in the first place. At the end of all of this, the comparative moral harm is, sure, in a very, very rare instance, we have a few dolphins that are harmed as a result of military fire, right? The comparative benefit is we just protect so much more dolphins on the outside in a world where we're able to do things like protect them from the vulnerabilities of the world. We thought that was substantially important also. At the end of my speech, what is the comparative here? We told you it was so substantially important to be able to weigh things like utilitarianism. When we told you that there was a very specific use case for dolphins to be able to be employed in military. When you're able to do things like better garner information, when you're able to do things like gather intel that is so substantially important in being able to do things like protect US citizens, we thought that was a moral consideration that was substantially important in this debate. They can't just go up and tell us, oh, it's not necessarily important because they can't consent to it. Note, the ways in which we consider moral considerations often do involve a way up of the substantial rights within this debate. When we told you that the US military had an obligation to protect the citizens, when we told you there was an obligation to cater towards the needs of the larger individuals on the ground, we thought that had to be contended with. We thought they didn't necessarily do that. But even if you didn't buy any of this material, we told you that it was so substantially important to be able to point towards a program like this, to be able to say that we have to do things like employ animals to be able to protect vulnerable individuals within the ground. We told you it was morally acceptable because it was something that we required within this debate.
I thank the second negative for that speech. I now invite third affirmative to conclude their team's case. Begin.
At the end of this debate, you may be confused about how to weigh up two moral frameworks, but I can tell you one thing about comparing these two. I can tell you that under our side, we have a certain moral harm. We have a certain moral harm that dolphins and some sort of intelligent life is forced into doing things that they don't want to do, that they are likely to die when they do these things, and that is guaranteed. But they cannot prove to you that there is a particular harm that comes under their side, because the only benefit they've proven is that maybe they identify some unnamed submarines in the ocean. It's unclear why that was going to save anyone in this world. It was deeply unclear how that resulted in any benefit at all. So if you are struggling to weigh up which one of these moral frameworks to go with, perhaps they both have credit, but ours has credit that is guaranteed. You are guaranteed to do something wrong when you allow this program to exist, and you are not guaranteed to prevent harm otherwise. We win this debate. Okay, let me establish two things before I get into two issues in this debate. I'm going to establish why they cannot simply assert utilitarianism, and secondly, I'm gonna make sure you believe that dolphins are indeed moral agents. Okay, on the first one, let's talk about utilitarianism compared to other moral decisions that we make. What we tell you at Cormac is that it is probably true that utilitarianism helps you make decisions sometimes based on the amount of harm that you cause, but there are limits to when we allow utilitarianism to extend to, and we give you many, many examples of these limits. We tell you that it is morally wrong to violate someone's autonomy and humanity by enslaving them, even if it was going to make the entire world better. We give you at first the example that it is wrong to kill someone if it were to prevent headaches eternally. Even though you save an infinite amount of suffering, it is wrong to murder that person. And at that point, what you believe is that there are objective moral wrongs. And if you believe that there are objective moral wrongs, then you believe that there is a limit on utility. And if you believe that there is a limit on utility, at the point at which we have proven to you that we meet the criteria of some of these objective moral wrongs, wrongs, to which they never deal with our arguments about like how you enslave them and how it is wrong to instrumentalize these animals, then we win this debate. Okay, second thing, on why dolphins are deserving moral agents, at least to some extent. I think there are a couple of things to say here. Their main argument, though, to keep in mind, is that they concede in some way that dolphins have some kind of capacity for some kind of like moral value, and they also concede that we ought to give animals moral rights to some extent. And I would be surprised if they got up here at third and defended something like animal abuse. Let me tell you why we ought to consider this highly in this debate. The first thing is that we gave you many, many reasons to believe that they do have like many things that give moral features. That is like feeling pain and pleasure. That is like having all of the same things that create humans that give humans their humanity. Things like language, things like social relationships. They tell us that this is different, it's to a lesser extent. But I want to point out that this is a massive anthropocentric bias, right? And this is the same kind of bias, preferencing your own version of how you perceive yourself as the total moral good, that led to things like colonialism. It's when people went to places like Africa and they said, oh, they have some kind of society, but it's inferior to ours, and on that we ought to enslave them. That is exactly the same moral harm they do under their side. And if they cannot prove that we somehow are able to get rid of that bias, I think that point stands. Even if you don't believe that, though, we still have established to you that there is some moral value to these. Finally, I think the last thing to say is that it is in some way impossible to know how much moral value they have, because it's impossible to know what a dolphin's experience is like. So maybe dolphins indeed do have a more complex social relationships and a more complex sense of morality, but they simply just don't know what the US military is because they don't live on land. Okay, at that point, what we have established to you is that you firstly should consider these as moral agents. Secondly, that even if you do not believe they're moral agents, there is a possibility that they are in the same way that humans are. But thirdly, if they are diminished moral agents, then you ought to protect them. And this is the point that Cormac makes to no response, is that the reason why rights exist, and we have them in an absolute sense, is to protect people who cannot protect themselves. That is the same reason, for instance, why we give people with intellectual disabilities rights, or why we give people with children rights. We give them rights so they are protected. At the end of that, two things you have to understand. Firstly, there are moral harms besides utility, and secondly, that dolphins are able to suffer those moral harms. We prove to you in this first point about harms to animals absolutely why. Firstly, we tell you about consent, about decision making, and how that is restricted. They tell you that, oh, it's really not like something like conscription really isn't that bad. I think it really is that bad. You remove freedom from those animals, but also in this world, these animals aren't even aware that they are being conscripted. That seems really fucked up, to like govern their life in a way in which they are not even aware of. Secondly, though, and perhaps more importantly, we tell you it is wrong to instrumentalize these animals. That is like, that is in the way that you like Pavlovianly like train them into doing things. And I think observe a couple of things here. Firstly, that is a probably very painful process, right? They probably have to like electrocute them or something to punish them when they make the wrong decisions and incentivize them to make them the right decisions. But secondly, to the extent that you're treating these animals as towards a particular end, and you admit that they do have moral features, you remove those moral features because you are saying you are simply the end to which we are able to identify these submarines or whatever they want to do. And I think at that point, you have absolutely acknowledged you have caused a moral harm. Their responses on trying to prove that animals are indeed not harmed. They tell us they're going to do things like feed animals. I would contend that animals' lives in the wild are better. I think we've proved like things like sociality and stuff is important to these animals, and I don't think you can have social relationships under their side of the house because it messes with how you train them. For instance, if these animals start getting dopamine from interacting with like all of these other all their animal friends, right? Then presumably that means they are trained worse because their only source of dopamine is not finding a submarine. They tell us also that also probably the bigger harm here is that these animals get shot and executed. And they say that, these animals are likely to be used in a covert way to rebut this. But why does that not hold up? That doesn't hold up because presumably at the point at which the US's enemies know about this program, they simply shoot every dolphin that they see because they don't know if it's a fucking plant, right? And I think at that point, you start executing not only the dolphins who are involved in their program, but the dolphins who weren't. And you just like start genociding entire species. They need to prove to us then that someone like China cares about the livelihoods of dolphins. Finally, their last argument here is simply to tell us that we use animals already in an instrumental way, and on that basis, it should be fine. Firstly, I think humanity has done many, many things throughout its existence which are not fine. It simply existing already is not moral basis to do it, but also we would oppose, we just oppose it in general. Finally, we make the point on why it is wrong for these people to conspire, and also for these dolphins to conspire. Dolphins probably less so since perhaps they are diminished moral agents, but we tell you that to no response that the US is a bad actor, that it has committed like egregious war crimes around the world, and they don't respond to that. Their only converse argument is that the US does some good things, but here they are deeply uncomparative, because they never prove to us that what these dolphins do are the only thing that will stop the US from continuing to do the good things that it does to protect its citizens. And secondly, we actually counter and say that actually these dolphins do have an effect in gathering intelligence for the US. And what that means is that you gather intelligence for something which has already a chokehold on the entire world, on trade, on all of those things. And I think the impact of that then is that those dolphins, are complicit, as are the people who work in this program, in benefiting an evil regime. But secondly, to the extent that the US did good things, that we don't think you harm those operations at all. At the end of that point then, it is deeply, deeply unclear how they get any benefit at all when they use these dolphins. They have said to us throughout this debate that perhaps they will be able to identify some submarines. I do not understand how that is something that outweighs the massive moral harms that we give you. The harms of slavery, the harms of instrumentalization. We've proved to you that dolphins matter as moral beings. You should believe that by now. We win.
Cool. I thank third affirmative for that speech. I now invite third negative to conclude the debate. Hear.
Good?
Yep.
Guys, if a dolphin was able to track down a submarine and determine who was in US water doing what, it means that A, the US military is simply more informed, B, they're able to de-escalate tensions in a better, more informed way, and C, they're able to not increase tensions with the assumed villain, which is probably just going to be China, which creates worse trade outcomes and worse military outcomes for so many different people. No, maybe it's hyperbolic, but this is an exact use case for how these dolphins are going to be used and how many people it can materially impact in this debate. We think we ought to care about the people involved in this debate to an incredibly high extent, and the opposition's determination that tracking a submarine isn't going to be useful is just simply not in fact in any way charitable in this debate. 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. 1, why the use of animals is not always the bad thing as they try and tell you it is, but 2, why this specific use of animals is not bad anyway, and 3, some stuff on the US military and why we are actually getting material benefits for people who, despite the opposition's anthropomorphic bias that they try and claim, are the most important actor in this debate. Firstly, why is the use of animals not always immoral? The main push here is to say that animals can't consent and to use, and it's morally equivalent to slavery. The first thing here I would say is a lack of consent isn't in and of itself a harm, right? I.e., children cannot consent to medical procedures, and we let parents opt in for them. This is to say that if we prove by our own rational ability opting in for them is a good thing for them, you ought not care about this assumed concern of consent, as consent must be based on some form of moral outcomes. But the second thing here I would say is we make morally equivalent judgments all the time in this world, right? Training a dog to roll over is not something that we as a general society deem to be immoral. This is to say that in the absence of outcomes which are bad, they cannot simply claim that this is an absolute truth. I.e., at the end of this, they must prove harms, which I'll get to in a bit. But 3, even if they do prove these incredible harms that are so bad for the dolphins, we deem so many actions moral if it is utile, i.e. farming. Note here, if the opposition wants to claim that farming, that farming is bad, I think they lose in this debate, because farming just provides people with food to live, and that's something we all care about. Note, if we are able to prove to you that dolphins saving lives in a military sense provides better outcomes for more people, I think we just win. I.e., at the end of this, it is not a valid win-con in of itself. The next thing they say here is that dolphins require basic rights. But sure, we think we're still able to do this in a world where they're opting, when we're opting in for them into this military system, right? This is to say that in the same way that we give people rights who choose to join the army because we give them free healthcare and this stuff, we tell you if we are able to treat these animals and dolphins in a good way, which is better, which is good for their own material outcomes, we would think that this is probably a good thing. I.e., Yeah, like at the end of this, we would tell you that then they want to claim that like all forms of like animal ownership, not human ownership of animals is bad. Like even saying that we should just like not have any pets. But the first thing I would say here is if the pets have a good life, I think it's fine. But secondly, at the end of this, which is kind of a push that we give you, which is true in many senses, that if we are able to say that owning a pet has like helped someone be happy and has like helped them in a, like become less depressed, we would tell you that this is utile in that sense. So. At the end of this, I think it's unclear why their simple push that it's always immoral to have any sort of ownership or use of animals. I don't think that this is necessarily true. So now let's talk about this specific use of animals and whether or not it's immoral. So then, here they want to push that like, oh, you know, we put animals at risk and at harm, and that's a bad thing. But the first thing I would say here is that our analysis at first neg still largely stands, which is to say that the average dolphin probably has a better life in this system than if they are not in this system. I.e., this is to say that they are no longer subject to things like pollution in the water. They are no longer subject to things like other animals, like who are the predators, eating them. They are simply likely to have access to medical stuff, for example, like free healthcare, because the US military is giving them free healthcare. We tell you that their lives are probably just materially better off in the long run, right? They're probably just going to live happier lives because they do not they are not concerned about like getting sick, or like they are simply just living longer, which we ought to think to be a good thing. But the second thing I would say is that because of this, we are able to opt in for them. We have made the decision that this is probably good, and we are able to make that choice. But 3, it's not also immoral when soldiers join the army for more money or like free healthcare. It's also not immoral when people working riskier jobs for better pay conditions. At the end of this, if you believe our analysis at first, that they actually just get material better life, like outcomes, because 1, they're not being put in a situation where they're going to be shot because the US Army does not want to lose their investment, it's probably likely that they are just living better lives. And for them, in the short term, they are just in a morally better situation. Note here, saving them from things like fishing, pollution, and illness is something that you ought to consider and is probably good. In the same way that parents are able to opt in for their children to have a medical treatment, we think we ought to be able to opt in for these dolphins to something that improves their life. Now, then they want to claim that like, oh, you know, we like in a world where this exists, it's probably just likely that the opposition military system is just going to like shoot all dolphins on sight because we know that they have a military purpose. The first thing I would say here is that it's just like empirically very hard to differentiate between what's a fish, what's a dolphin, and what's a shark on a radar. It's like really hard to actually determine what you're meant to be shooting at. So I think it's unlikely that an opposition military force is just going to be going through and shooting all dolphins in the water. But the second thing here is I would say that if an enemy starts shooting all dolphins, it's no longer worth it in any sense for the US military to deploy these dolphins in this fashion. I.e., they're not just going to like go and send dolphins to die because they're no longer able to fulfill their purpose of like tracking down a submarine. We think it is in the US's the US Navy's imperative to use them in a way which protects their general health. Because no, if you want to use their analysis, these dolphins just become assets, and this is something that the US military will likely care about. We don't think they're just going to be sent to die. We think they're going to be sent to be used in ways where they're likely to come back healthy, because that means the US military is making more money and doing a better use, doing its job better. Then they want to say that we're taking away what the animal cares about most, but we tell you they're still able to live in pleasurable ways. They're still able to have fun in a system where the US military is supporting them. We think it's far more likely that the US Navy is trying to make them live in a better circumstance, such that they're healthy and happy and able to fulfill their job in the best possible way. At the end of this, I think it's really unclear that the speculative moral assertions that they make down the bench on side affirmative are true. I think it's far more likely that these dolphins are living happier, healthier, longer lives, and it's probably just better for them. But now let's talk about what we think is actually the most important issue in this debate, which is to say who gets better outcomes for the people, right? Note here, all our mechs about an informed Navy and a better Navy just means that 1, we're able to help humans, which is far more important, but 2, we're also just able to help more organisms than a few dolphins, right? Because we're helping more people, which is also good. But the third thing I would say is if a dolphin is able to allow us to avoid a nuclear fallout, such that all dolphins die in a world where nuclear fallout exists, that's probably something that dolphins ought to care about. Now, so let's talk about some notes on the military. Why are they just more informed, and why are they able to do their job better? Note, this is stuff we told you at first, which has largely not been responded to. We think at the end of this, you are able just to find the submarine. We think that is something that you all care about. Why is this the most important issue in this debate? Because material benefits to the people no longer being bombed because the US wasn't informed enough to opt out of bombing them is probably something that's good, right? Because note here, humans are the most important actor, as they are the only organism we know also feels pain and pleasure in the way we deem it moral to care about. This is to say, at the end of this, it's really unclear that dolphins actually experience sentiency in the same way that we deem it moral to care about. We think humans do, we know that, and our entire morality system that exists in this world in debating is something which is just to say that we care about humans. Also, the US Navy is doing better at their job. Even if they're corrupt, we think it's better if they're doing their corrupt job and not bombing many more people. Thank you.
Well, I thank all speakers for those excellent speeches. I invite you to cross the floor and shake hands, or just thumbs up each other if you don't want to, risk COVID or whatever. We will deliberate for 15 minutes and call you back in when we're cold.
It's Wiley in here, it's giant.
Yeah, I don't know. Very kind of.
The fact that it's like this giant room and we're still recording with this.
Yeah. I know.
You're like, surely there's a camera in here.
Probably. Okay, is that set up and good?
Yeah, it's recording.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. No, I'm sure that they can edit it for us. Cool. All right. Thanks everyone for that debate. God, start. Okay, start. Okay. Thank you everyone for that debate. I certainly enjoyed it. I hope that you guys did as well. The way that I'm going to structure this feedback is I'm going to start with some general feedback, then we're going to go into how we saw the debate, and then so the call, and then how we saw the debate. Firstly, in terms of general feedback, 3 things to note here. The first is that for this debate and any other that involves some sort of grand, moral deliberation about what is actually moral, what is actually true, note that it is, of course, very difficult to reach some sort of absolute moral truth in a debate. The standard by which we judge debates is that of what the average intelligent voter would find most persuasive. And so, even though I think it is valiant to try and assert what is absolutely moral and what is not, I think it is much more useful to frame that around what the average reasonable person is most likely to find moral. So whether that looks like pointing to already existing notions of what morality, what we deem moral based on pre-existing examples, or whether that is, intuition checking in terms of what do you think is considered moral in these situations, that just can be a lot more fruitful in helping persuade a judge that your side is more correct in terms of your definition of morality, rather than taking, for example, a hardline stance or saying that one school of philosophical truth is inherently more moral than another. The next piece of general feedback is that it's important to, again, in debates like this, which can seem quite nebulous, or where the burden of proof seems quite nebulous, to explicitly tell us what you are trying to, or what you think is the most important metric in the debate, and then to prove why you have proven it. It was a bit unclear in this debate at times whether you were trying to prove that, it was moral to treat dolphins in a certain way, whether the existence of a program and its outcomes were moral, whether what the program was contributing to was moral, making sure that you are outlining what you think the metric for the debate should be and proving why you satisfy it. If your opposition's metric is quite different to yours, trying to prove why you satisfy that, or trying to prove why your metric is the most valid interpretation of the topic. The last thing to say, and I know that this is tricky because this is a debate about military dolphins, is trying to explain in a bit more detail what this actually looks like. I thought it was, it's just quite difficult to imagine a dolphin providing crucial intel about the insides of a submarine, right? So obviously, again, it is quite a speculative debate, but trying to give more detail about what this is likely to look like, the kinds of missions, or how often these dolphins, or seals, I guess as well, we kind of excluded them from the debate, how often they are likely to be deployed, what kinds of intels they are likely to be capable of gathering and then communicating, and the scale or the importance of this intel. That would have made it a lot easier if you could prove to me that these were likely to be very high stakes, very important intel. That would make it a lot easier to prove oh, okay, then clearly this is something that is either going to be super good or super bad, or you can prove that the circumstances were not that important. It's also, I think, unclear that they weren't just I don't know, sniffing out minerals and stuff like that. There are lots of other uses that you could point to for the capacities of these animals that could have enriched the debate by making it a bit more grounded in reality, as silly as that sounds. So, in terms then of how we saw the debate, this was a unanimous decision. It was unanimously quite a close decision, but we have narrowly awarded it to the affirmative. So congratulations, commiserations. Here's how we saw it. The first question to establish is, what is the metric for morality that we should use to determine whether this is moral or not? Affirmative tells us that take essentially a deontological stance, which is to say that there are things that are objectively moral in every circumstance, or that we should never do. And they give the example of like it's always bad to kill one guy, even if it would prevent a whole world of headaches later on. The alternative framing that we get from the negative team is that utilitarianism is actually a much more realistic metric. And the examples that they point to are like practices that we already employ, which put utility as the end goal of an action, even if there is some harm to it. So something like, eating meat, we kill an animal to feed our people because we assume that utility of feeding those people is greater than the utility of that animal's like unimpeded life. And I think that to an extent, or the response that we get from the affirmative team is that actually, insofar as utilitarianism is a good metric, there are obviously limits to it. We intuitively have aversions to pushing utilitarianism to the extreme. That is to say, putting one person at extreme harm for some sort of broader good to society, and they give the example of slavery. And while I think that that is potentially true, obviously then that means that I think the negative contention then is that the harm that is being incurred to these dolphins or sea creatures is not as extreme so as to fit into these marginal cases that the average reasonable person would be intuitively opposed to. And given that the negative team were able to outline, I think, more realistic or more grounded examples of where society expresses its moral preferences, I think we did buy that utilitarianism was probably a more reasonable or more realistic framework than a deontological claim to like some sort of absolute moral truth. But of course, that meant that the harms that were being, the harms that were occurring to these dolphins and these sea lions had to be lesser than the utility that they would like then ultimately result in, which is just how utilitarianism works. So the questions then become this. Firstly, what are the harms that are accruing to these animals? Secondly, what are the benefits then that we can get out of it? In terms then of what the harms that accrue to dolphins and to sea lions, what the affirmative presents is threefold. The first is that they say that there is an inherent moral harm because these dolphins and these sea lions cannot consent to what we are conscripting them for. The response that we get from the negative team is that yes, they cannot consent, essentially they do concede there, but they say that there is a, I guess, lower moral standard that we ought hold animals to. They aren't the same as humans, therefore it is unclear that violating their consent is the same as violating a human's consent. The response that we get from affirmative team is, I think at third affirmative, is to say, well, it's also unclear why they aren't as morally valuable as humans, which I guess is like quite difficult to prove, right? In that it is difficult to prove that a dolphin is or is not a moral creature whose needs ought be met. I think intuitively, you would argue that they are, sentient to some extent. There is some degree of consent there, or there is some degree of pain that can be incurred to them, and therefore to force that pain on them without them agreeing to it in any way is potentially bad. Maybe not to the same extent as it would be for humans, but there is a potential for harm there. When can we override consent? The negative team, tells us that, well, we are actually okay with overriding the consent of those who don't have the capacity to consent if it can be good for them. And they point to instances of, a parent overriding a child's desires when it comes to giving them medical treatment, because that child cannot consent. I think the affirmative's push is then twofold. Firstly, which is to say that this is not actually a situation like that. This is a situation where they need protection, and firstly, we do not know what is best for dolphins. Therefore, it is unclear why this is equivalent in that we are overriding their consent, but we don't know that it will ultimately be good for them, which I will get onto in a second. But the second thing that they point out, which I think is quite helpful, is that given that there is some violation of consent that these animals would in some way be capable of giving, because, presumably these dolphins would not work for the military were they not trained to do so. The bar for violating that consent, or for, going against that consent or the will of the dolphin, is higher than it otherwise, higher than it would be for using any sort of other resource, right? Or perhaps that's poorly phrased. The bar is raised for the degree of utility that has to come from this decision because there is some sort of violation of consent that the average reasonable person would otherwise care about. That's a better way of phrasing that. The response that we get from the negative team is like, oh, we actually let people do harmful things, or that I think comes out at third negative, is to analogize this to like other instances where we let you consent to harmful things, where the utility, where you might be damaging yourself for some sort of other payoff, like, you know, a particularly like damaging job, for example. The problem with this analogy though is I think that it firstly is contingent on you consenting to those harms in the first place, which I think you concede is not possible. And secondly, you are consenting to those harms for a payoff. And it's unclear that firstly there is payoff for the dolphins, but secondly that they perceive of it as a payoff. What that means is that this mechanism of like you are able to opt into harmful things probably doesn't stand, meaning given that it's unclear that the dolphin can opt in at all to the things that are potentially harmful. So at this point, unclear that, or it's clear, I don't think that the dolphins can consent, and that the fact that they cannot consent means that the utility must be quite high because there is probably some inherent harm to taking away their capacity to choose to do something else. The next harm that affirmative points to is that the environment that they could be in is probably quite harmful because you are putting them in harm's way and because you are depriving them of other things that a dolphin might enjoy in life, like, you know, being able to roam freely, having a social structure, sex apparently, which I didn't know about dolphins, but you know, the more you know. The response that we get from the negative team is that firstly to say that there is a decent chance that environment would be good because they can do things like, you know, they get medical treatment where they wouldn't in the wild. The second response is that the Navy has an incentive to protect these creatures because they have an incentive for these creatures to be not only well looked after, like in good physical shape, but it also that they like wouldn't deploy them if they knew that they were going to get shot, for example, if they knew that their opposing army was going to shoot any dolphin that came their way. I think that both of us agreed that the affirmative probably could have responded or should have responded to this in greater detail, which is to say, I think this was a fairly flawed argument, or there were definitely ways that the affirmative could have responded. In terms then of what we are able to enter into the debate as the average intelligent or the average reasonable person to like intuition check, I think it is just true that at no point did the negative team prove the capacity of the US government, although they proved there was an incentive to treat them well. It was unclear that the US government had the capacity to treat them well, which means that although it doesn't totally discredit your point, it is a bit unclear as to how you are going to achieve that outcome of protecting them, of creating this super good environment. What the affirmative point out is that even if you are able to do things like extend the dolphin's life by like, you know, giving it medicine, etc., it is unclear what is preferable for a dolphin, what is their idea of a quality life. Because they, you know, probably, you know, given that they are wild animals, probably value the things that wild animals value, like freedom, like social structures, presumably. Again, it's quite unclear. It's very difficult to tell what a dolphin prefers. Overall, though, it is probably true that these dolphins are probably put at some degree of risk. They are working for the military. They are being sent out into, you know, active military areas, even if that is infrequent. They are being held captive when they wouldn't otherwise be held captive. It is unclear that that is necessarily good for them. They may not inherently be hurt, but there is a capacity to put them in harm's way that I think doesn't exist under the affirmative side of the house, which means that, again, there is potential for harm that otherwise does not exist. The last harm, though, that the affirmative point to is the harm of instrumentalization, which is to say that it is bad to not only take agency away from a creature to restrict its ability to do what it wants, but also to shape what it wants into something that what a human wants, to strip not only its agency but to weaponize it, which I think gets very little response from the negative team. And although I think it could have been stepped out in greater detail, or actually it could have been proven that, for example, this instrumentalization was likely to occur in a way that was harmful for those animals. I think you allude to, like, you know, shocking animals to get them to like not do what you don't want and incentivizing them to get what you do want. That could have been proven in more detail, but I think it was probably true that you were altering the will of this animal to do something where it would otherwise have probably acted in a way that would be best for the animal. And given that you were removing the capacity for it to act in its own self-interest and you were making it act in yours, even if firstly that there was probably some degree of harm to that by like retraining them in like a Pavlovian way, but secondly there is a moral harm to it, which I think the affirmative proved, which was to say that there is a great degree of harm that is imposed upon the animal when you remove its capacity to act in its own self-interest. So, all of that being said, clearly then this has to be an incredibly utile thing for the Navy to do in order to justify morally the harm that these dolphins are otherwise suffering, or the potential harm that they could suffer, because it's unclear that the dolphin is accruing any benefits from being in this program. Sorry, this is a long OA, but it was a very dense debate. On this question then of utility, is the US Navy a moral actor? And therefore, is the work of these sea creatures going to be put towards a moral use? Affirmative tells us no. They tell us that the US Navy has committed war crimes and the US military in general, which I think most average reasonable voters probably think is a bad thing. The response that we get from the negative team is that actually the US could be a potentially moral actor. They are obliged to act in the interest of their citizens. They are potentially, doing good things by like averting crises, for example. I think the problem with this analysis is that it was never proven that the average reasonable voter is not an American necessarily, it is not anyone in particular. It is unclear why a military body which acts in the service of one group of people, if that comes at the cost of other people, potentially, especially if the people who are being harmed by those actions are being harmed to a greater extent than the people who are being protected by those actions being protected, it is unclear that that is actually a utilitarian, or that is actually a worthwhile moral trade-off. The other thing to note though, which I think limits this argument of utility quite a lot, is something that a piece of analysis that we get from the affirmative team, which is to say that actually, what is discovering submarines going to do? I think this acknowledgement that is very unclear that these seals are going to be the difference between World War III and not, I think from both teams to an extent, is symmetric, right? It's unclear that these seals are going to be more harmful than they will be good. It's unclear that they're going to be deployed for more harmful things than they would be good. Clearly they'll be deployed for some sort of intelligence operation to do some sort of a means to some sort of end, and the capacity of the scale of that means to an end is probably quite limited, or it is at least symmetric. So the morality of what they are going to be able to do is not dependent on how they are used, but rather the end goal of the military. I don't know if that was explained particularly well. All of that is to say, I don't think that they themselves are not going to be committing war crimes or protecting people in the US. They are going to be contributing to an organization to some extent, symmetrically in either world, also symmetrically in either characterization, that either does good or evil, which means that the inherent morality of the US military is then the axis by which we should judge the morality of the SEALs' actions within the US military. Given that, I thought that the average reasonable person would probably consider the actions of the military not as utile, or not particularly utile, or not meeting the bar of utility that they ought be in order to justify the harms that would otherwise accrue to these dolphins. That's why we narrowly gave this debate to the affirmative team, because they proved that harm was not worth that trade-off. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to give feedback, or I'm happy to just let you go and I don't know, have dinner or something preferable. Thank you all for the debate, and good luck tomorrow. Is everyone going to the social?
Yeah.
Cool. If people want feedback, are we